Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us for our final conference. And we've got here, obviously, the participants and partners on the MigRom project, as well as other colleagues who have come to share the results and discuss the results of their research on very, very similar themes, and we're looking forward to that. I'd like to introduce the project to you this morning, and I'd like to begin on a somewhat personal angle and describe how my own interest and involvement in the topic of Roma migrations began. My first encounter with Roma migrants from Eastern Europe in the West was in 1988 when I took on a support role in a public campaign led by a Roma NGO to grant settlement rights to Eastern European Roma whose asylum applications had been rejected and who had at that point exhausted the legal procedure and were campaigning for the right to remain. In 1989, the organization that I worked for became the very first NGO to lobby the Council of Europe in respect specifically of Roma migrants from Eastern Europe, and in that connection also in respect to the precarious conditions and circumstances of Roma in Eastern Europe. At the time, of course, Central Eastern European countries were not yet represented in the Council of Europe, and that was the beginning of the process in which the Council of Europe took an interest, not just in migrants, but in the situation of the Roma in the countries from which the migrants came. My own choice at the time as a linguistics student to focus on the Romani language for my PhD research was very much motivated by my wish to continue to be able to contribute to that campaign and to be a part of it. And yet at the time, neither I nor my Roma colleagues that I worked with or that I worked for in that organization felt it necessary to flag that partnership as co-production. I think at the time that term would have seemed to us to be very patronizing and not actually capturing the essence of what the relationship was about. Instead, I was very much inclined to take on the perspective of the Roma activists that I worked with and worked for, to try to adopt it as my own, and at the same time to use the academic skills that I had to acquired in other contexts to be able to support their cause. Shortly after I took on an academic position in 1996 here in Manchester, I was approached by the Council of Europe and invited to produce the what became the very first policy report for a European institution on post-communist East-West migrations of Roma. That report was submitted to the European Committee on Migration, as it was called at the time, CDMG, and eventually it made its way to the Committee of Ministers, and some of the recommendations, although in a watered-down version, were adopted years later by the Committee of Ministers at the highest level of policy at the Council of Europe. That report drew directly on my experience of working with Roma migrants during that time when I worked with the Roma NGO. And in it, I formulated four principal observations. The first one was that the migration of Roma was not nomadism. So Roma who migrate don't do so necessarily because they are nomads. Now, this is obvious to everybody in this room, but at the time, it was not necessarily obvious to policymakers. And I think that even today, it is still not always obvious to all policymakers. The second observation was that the migration of Roma was primarily one of family networks and not of individuals. Next, I suggested that due to their particular situation of social marginalization in the countries of origin, many Roma migrants are prepared to take particular risks that are not typically taken by migrants of other groups, and that in turn often increases their vulnerability. And finally, I pointed out that governments often react with radically with extraordinary measures toward Roma migrants, at times providing support measures to Roma outside the mainstream frameworks of support, but at times equally taking special measures to exclude Roma. And those measures are often accompanied by arguments that reveal prejudice or target a particular notion of Roma culture, in particular references to work ethics and to family values. So it's been 20 years now since that report was written and submitted to the Council of Europe, and I think that in both the political and the academic discussion, we're still dealing very much with these same questions. So we're asking, for example, what historical circumstances provide Roma with a migration capital that is in some ways similar, but in some ways perhaps distinct from that of other migrant groups. We're asking, how do family networks support migration? What drives sometimes Roma migrants into precarious circumstances? And we're asking, what extraordinary measures do authorities sometimes put in place in reaction to the arrival of Roma? And today, of course, we're asking these questions in a much more developed, much more fine-tuned, much more sophisticated theoretical framework of research in migration studies and in neighboring disciplines. Now, as we all know and we all remember, the public debate surrounding the arrival of Eastern European Roma migrants in Western European cities intensified greatly immediately following the accession of Romania to the European Union in 2007, and there were various measures, among them in this country, the emergence of a large-scale police operation called Operation Gulf, led by the London Metropolitan Police, supported by EU funding, which set out to tackle alleged human trafficking networks led by Romanian Roma that were said to be operating to exploit vulnerable Roma for profit. That operation was accompanied by media reports that often displayed images of extravagant houses that were being built by Roma in Romania, supposedly from the proceeds of such criminal activity. That publicity had an impact on many local interventions. Here in Manchester, for example, the local authority was confronted with a petition against Romanian Roma migrants in 2009 and set up a dedicated high-level Roma strategy group in response, which we'll hear about perhaps more tonight. After the mass expulsion of Roma migrants from France in 2010, the European Union set up its framework for national strategies for Roma inclusion in 2011, and it started to prioritize Roma across a variety of activities. One such initiative, marginal perhaps on the whole in the bigger picture, was the launch of the European Academic Network on Romani Studies. And this was originally intended, perhaps not everybody knows, it was originally intended by the European Commission as a network to showcase Roma culture. And on the advice of the people that were called to advise on it, became something different. Another initiative in that connection was the 7th Framework funding call that was referred to in 2011-12 as dealing with diversity and cohesion, the case of the Roma in the European Union. And it is that call that the MigRom consortium formed around and applied for successfully for a grant. Our aim was to try to apply a new paradigm in migration studies to the study of Romanian Roma migrants. We wanted to deliver what we called at the time an ethnography of Romani migration, something which at the time was much needed and absent. In the meantime, there has been a proliferation of ethnographies of Roma migration, and the participation here, as well as the work of many colleagues who were unable to join us today, shows that. But we wanted to look at the internal socioeconomic organization of Roma migrant communities, the transnational social networks that support them, but also at public and political reactions to the settlement of the arrival of Roma migrants at local level and the impact that they have on the migrant communities. And once again, MigRom, of course, was not the only initiative to address these questions, and the presence of other colleagues here, and the work published in recent years on the topic is testimony to the interest that's emerged in recent years precisely in these topics. But in the MigRom consortium, we took what we thought and still think was a rather unique approach in several ways. So first of all, we launched a multi-site investigation with teams working in 5 different countries, and each team worked with a local community of Roma migrants. These communities often came from the same regions, in some cases from the same locations, and in many cases had family connections among themselves as well. We assembled a cross-disciplinary project team with expertise in history, anthropology, sociology, and linguistics. And it included researchers of various levels of seniority, people who had spent their entire careers studying various aspects of Roma communities, junior researchers, many of them fluent in the Romani language. The team included also 3 academic researchers of Romani background and many research assistants of Romani background as well, which all projects engaged. And so with a grant of about 2.5 million euros over a period of 4.5 years and some 35 people who were involved in the project, part-time or full-time, at some point or other, MigRom is probably the largest scale collaborative international research project in Romani studies so far. The team applied a variety of methods, including participant observation, life history interviews, archive research, quantitative data collection through questionnaires. And the research proceeded in 3 stages. We began with a pilot phase, which was intended to get to know more about the communities, but mainly to formulate questions that were of interest to everybody. We started with an open-ended interview guide where we collected questions and gradually harmonized the research questions across the various sites. So informed by the pilot, we set out to carry out what we called the extended survey. The results were published in the form of a fairly uniform template that is found online on the project website. They became available in June 2015. And questions addressed include the demographic profile of households, levels of qualification, levels of employment, patterns of employment, access to services, housing, education, migration history, relations with local institutions, family networks, problems, aspirations. And at this stage, the individual partners also began to develop their own research specializations, benefiting from the collaboration and the availability of comparative data from various sites, but also benefiting from the exchange in different directions. So we understood cross-disciplinary research in that context as approaching the same questions, but from different approaches and different perspectives. And this has led to a variety of new insights, which to us demonstrates, I think, the rewards of this unique intersection of methods. And I'll mention just a few of them, and the rest, of course, are there in the project outputs, some of them published, some of them in preparation. So we were able to understand family structure and fertility patterns, reproduction patterns, for example, and its role in shaping external attitudes to Roma, as well as changes brought about through the migration to family structure and to the aspirations of individuals. We looked at the impact of migration on the sending communities, what changes come about in Roma communities, but also in non-Roma communities in the sending communities, and the relations between Roma and non-Roma back in the origin communities. We explored how historically displacement and mobility within Romania was a result of social exclusion, of land reforms, of recruitment into the state economy, how it was able to shape new communities, new Roma communities that came about through those different factors, how that manifests itself in family structures, adoption practices, the shaping of dialect boundaries, among other things. And we explored how this historical context in Romania helped perpetuate a status of Roma as kind of integrated outsiders who continued to capitalize to some extent on mobility and multi-site networking to earn a living within Romania, and how this experience has formed part of their migration capital when migrating slightly before or after 1990. We also looked at contradictions in government policy, not just the widely cited issue of securitization, but also the role of different state policies to regulation, deregulation of housing policy, the long-term effect that access to housing has on access to services in general, and as a result on the stability and, as a result of that, the aspirations of community members. Some of these results will be presented this morning by members of the MigRom consortium. Some are already accessible online in the form of publications and pre-publications. Some will be published later this year in the form of an edited volume to which the partners have contributed, called Open Borders, Unlocked Cultures, Romanian Roma Migrants in Western Europe, which will be published by Routledge. And there's also a series of other publications in preparation. All of the MigRom partners, all of the academic partners engaged Romanian Roma as research assistants, and in most cases these were members of the communities in which the research took place. They participated in project meetings, they helped contributed to the research design, to the fieldwork methodology. They were trained in fieldwork methodology and data protection protocols. They supported the interviews, they supported the archiving, transcription, archiving, processing of interview material in the Romani language. All interviews were conducted in Romani. And perhaps most importantly, they provided their insights and their interpretation into the data evaluation process. And in some cases, this has also led to co-authorship with the Roma assistants. This is separate from some of our research staff who happen to be Roma by background as well. So acting as co-authors of some of the reports. They also took on a major role in the consortium's public engagement activities here in Manchester. The project delivered a 3-year community outreach program in partnership with the City Council, and it was the Roma assistants and outreach workers who led that initiative, as well as initiated a forum that led eventually to the emergence of a local Roma advocacy group. And so in this way, the project facilitated both a new model for research co-production, to use the term that has now become popular, with Roma, and a lasting contribution as well to capacity building and we can say as well to empowerment. The consortium included a local authority, Manchester City Council, and a Roma NGO, the European Roma and Travellers Forum, which at the time when we launched the consortium was the only Roma NGO that had any kind of official status with a European institution. The exchange with Manchester City Council offered an opportunity to draft and discuss policy documents and have direct input into City Council reports on Roma and committee meetings. And we'll be hearing tonight in the panel discussion about some of the experiences in working with the City Council. You can also find on the website reports by Manchester City Council relating to its participation on the project. And the European Roma and Travellers Forum provided feedback on the survey design, but in particular in the initial stage on some of the policy briefings, and took on the role of supporting the dissemination of policy briefings in the meetings and circles of exchange of policymakers and Roma NGOs at European level. The academic partners also had a schedule of training sessions that were organized for local authority officers, public service providers in areas like education, healthcare. There was input into media debates as well, sometimes in key national outlets, daily newspapers, television, radio broadcasts, on a variety of issues, including the lifting of employment restrictions on Romanian citizens, which of course had a direct bearing during the time of the project in 2014 on the communities that our research focused on, issues such as forced evictions, targeted interventions of various kinds by authorities, education segregation measures, education support measures, public statements by politicians among Roma, and more. In this regard, the consortium never adopted any uniform position on any of these issues. Rather, what we did was we encouraged our members to partake in these debates at all levels, at the level of local policy, national policy, and in some cases also European policy. And for this, the project did earn the respect of many stakeholders and of its sponsors. Inevitably, it also earned occasional criticism from those whose positions and actions came under the scrutiny of members of the project and individual researchers associated with the project. And I think we learned from that you just cannot swim without getting wet. This was, of course, amplified by the fact that the project coincided with some significant developments in the relations between research and policy in general, and in regard to Roma in particular. There was, first of all, an increase in recent years in many countries in the direct monitoring of the impact that research has on policy and on public engagement. In some countries, this has been strictly scripted into the evaluation of research outputs of higher education and of grant awarding procedures. And so it has implications for the way that we structure and organize our research. Specifically in connection with policy on Roma, the new EU strategies launched in 2011, 2012, and the pool of funding that accompanied them created a market for commissioned expertise, but also networking opportunities. This drew attention to EU policy on Roma. It also created new opportunities to intertwine research with policy. But it has also placed policy on Roma under unprecedented scrutiny. And the more intense networking, or the greater variety of engagement, also sharpened differences in approaches, differences that are in part epistemological by nature. In part, they're strategic, relating to the way in which we envision and implement the relationship between research and policy, and research and advocacy. And all of this has prompted discussion about the role of academic research as a supporting instrument for policy and for advocacy. These are questions that I think are likely to remain with us for quite some time. I received in the last few days a number of private messages from colleagues who were unable to join us this week, but some have referred to the end of an era in Romani studies. Now, they weren't referring specifically to the fact that we are now in the final year of the MigRom project. Rather, they were referring to the fact that we seem to be standing on a kind of a crossroads in this area, where organized research networking has come to be interpreted with aspirations for some kind of power of spokesmanship. And some might rejoice, and others might see this as cause for concern. Because as researchers, we are, of course, also citizens, and as socially responsible citizens, we often wish to be able to put our knowledge to good use for a better society. And certainly that is much of what this project has been about, and it's also in the subtitle of the project, which says Causes, Effects, and Future Engagement Strategies. So it's not just descriptive. But that doesn't mean that our knowledge should be regarded necessarily as an instrument of power, and certainly not, it would certainly be wrong to equate, I think, the quest for knowledge with an attempt to gain or to maintain some kind of spokesmanship power. And it would also be wrong, therefore, for such an equation to be used to deny people the right to continue to develop and disseminate knowledge. So I hope that the next couple of days will give us an opportunity to address some of these questions alongside the fascinating case studies that we'll be hearing about. We'll have an opportunity once again tonight to talk about the policy research interface, and we all look forward to an interesting exchange on methods and theory and facts and much more. Thank you very much.